Yeah, cool. Well, Corey, thank you so much for coming. This is great. Great to see you. The last time we had Crestview doing an event was right after the election. Evan was on stage, and we just talked about what is this election going to mean for the tech community and the tech community in Calgary more specifically. And now the budget has come out, and we kind of know what this election now means for the tech community, especially here in Calgary. And so maybe give us your sense of like, what does this budget mean, and what should folks who are involved in the space and the industry be looking out for?
Yeah, so I've described this budget in a few different places as an economist budget, which makes sense. We've got an economist prime minister, a pretty good one in my opinion. And when I think about it, and when I say that, what I really mean is it's approached in this methodical way where it works through the challenges in front of us. So an economist would say, well, what are we trying to do? Step one. Step two, what tools do we have on hand? And then step three, from there, how do we bridge to where we want to be? Like, what are we going to do? And what we're trying to do is just fundamentally reimagine our productivity, affordability through things like housing investments, and also spend big to fundamentally change our trading relationships in the world and our long-term prospects, which have, of course, been very tied to the United States. They'll continue to be tied to the United States. I think we all acknowledge that, know that. But they need to be less tied. Canada needs to have more ability to walk its own path. And so, okay, that's great. That's the problem. That's what we want to do. What do we have on hand? And Canada's got a few things going for it. Obviously, resources. We are a huge country. We have a ton of natural resources, whether it be oil and gas or timber or critical minerals, which will be increasingly important. We could build whole supply chains here, from the ground up. We don't have them right now, but we could, because we've got what's needed for this 21st century economy, maybe not being utilized at all in some cases right now. And we have human resources. You look at OECD data, and we are the most educated. And now, with asterisk, we measure it a little bit different than other countries, right? I don't want to overstate that, but we have incredibly high participation at the post-secondary level, and it manifests in a lot of white-collar, communities like we have here in Calgary, just like a ton of engineers, for example. But we also have money. And I know, we're in a scarcity mindset, I think, as a globe, not even just as a country. But Canada is an incredibly wealthy country. If you look at our debt to GDP, because of course you want to compare your debt to your capacity to manage debt, we are pretty good. I think we're third in the G7, maybe fourth, depending on where it is, but right there. And there are, Japan is like a mile ahead of us. They got a lot of debt. If you look at net debt, which takes in all of the assets, including pensions, so not all of that really accessible, but we are the lowest net debt to GDP. And that does provide us additional capacity because, for example, unlike the Americans, we don't need to worry about paying for pensions down the road. Our pensions are fully solvent. And we have the second lowest deficit. So as much as we are in a scarcity mindset, when we're sitting there saying, what do we have? One of the things we need to say we have is fiscal capacity, is money. So we've got those things, so how are we going to use them? And what I love about the budget, and of course I have to love it because I'm the Liberal MP, but what I sincerely love about the budget is that it applies these things in a way to create a more competitive, productivity spurring landscape. I think tech is a huge benefactor of that. We'll get into it for sure. Yeah. And it is taking this kind of standard, let's really get laissez-faire going, economist brain, left brain thing, with some pretty big industrial spending and some pretty big industrial policy, which further spurs things. So it's going to be quite a potent combination, a combination of creating a rule framework that allows more investment and more growth and more innovation with big government spending to fundamentally reorient our economy in ways that we think are going to be necessary in the coming century.
Absolutely. So I think that's a great overview of what this budget is, what it's trying to accomplish. You posted a video on X yesterday, and it did a good job of sort of laying out how much of the budget is. We'll do questions at the end. So
this isn't a question. This is a request. Would you two please switch microphones so that the speaker matches to the side?
Oh, sure.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. Yeah. That's fair. That's
I
fair.
love that. I thought I was gonna have to. This was gonna be a situation. No, okay. All right,
It's
that's
more
cool.
a point of order.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, we got you. All right, cool. Okay. No, that's great. You did a good job of sort of laying out kind of where the money is going and 4 different buckets. So over the next 5 years, spending 110 billion towards productivity and competitiveness, 30 billion for defense over the next 5 years, 115 billion for infrastructure over the next 5 years, and 25 billion over the next 5 years for housing. And so what I wanted to do, so you guys can all sort of follow along with me, is to kind of go through each one of those and sort of their role in tech. We might not get to housing, unfortunately, but I think there's a lot of really juicy stuff within the first 3. Infrastructure, especially around AI, data centers and energy. Defense, I'm super curious what kind of like how we go from 0 or like close to 0 on defense companies to going to 1 or even 100, and like 0 to 1 in Peter Thiel's sense. And then talking about the productivity and competitiveness. So maybe let's start on productivity and competitiveness, if you will. Caroline Rogers, one of the senior governors at the Bank of Canada, in March of last year, quote unquote, broke the glass on the productivity crisis in Canada, which largely is sort of hours worked per GDP. And so what this has spurred is now we have the productivity super deduction, but largely it's a result of really concentrated industries with very few sort of players in the space, and who are not forced to necessarily invest in building their productivity capacity within their companies. So how do things like this, the productivity super deductor, how will that sort of help industries and folks, and maybe give a background to it, but how will it help enterprise invest in some of those tools?
Yeah, and so I'll just start by saying those numbers you mentioned, that's the accrual basis. On a cash basis, it's almost $500 billion over the next 5 years that the government is spending in these areas. It's a lot of money, and the productivity is one of the bigger buckets because it's the one that's going to have the broadest, I think, impact, right? You know, if you're going to see impact from all of them, but that is really creating an environment for all businesses to do better and to thrive. So productivity, I mean, I don't know, I'm older than I look. My whole life we've been talking about Canada lagging in productivity, and it's for sure true. You pull up the charts, you look at them, and we are far behind many of our peers, especially the United States. I will say a lot of Europe has struggled with productivity over the last bit as well. It's not a uniquely Canada problem. But productivity doesn't come from us all grinding it out until 3 a.m. Productivity it's a rate function, right? Like how much work are we doing per hour? Or how much are we producing per hour of work, I mean to say. And so mostly that comes from investment. That comes from capital investment. So I've now got a machine to build widgets faster, or investments in technologies, capital tech spends that allow you all of a sudden to move through your work at a more prodigious rate. And we know that, right? So we want to incentivize that kind of activity. We also know that some of those technologies, don't exist or haven't been applied to use cases. So we also want to expand the use of shred, so that we're getting more R&D spending. And I'll tell you, one of the challenges that's easily pointed to, and I think accurately pointed to on Canada's productivity is when you look at R&D, and my old colleague Guy from the University of Calgary, will know this. Canada, we have really big, wonderful institutions that spend a lot on R&D, largely with government funding. And we don't really have private R&D, the way the Americans do. We simply don't.
Yeah.
And we are not going to fundamentally be able to change corporate productivity as long as it continues to be so heavily rooted in the public sector. The public sector is amazing. I love it. I've worked in the public sector the last 10 years of my career here. But we really need to spur businesses, and that's going to require them accessing it. So shred, for example, notorious right now. You're a little slow. You don't know whether you've got it or not. In some ways, it's a backwards-looking tax credit you cross your fingers for instead of a forward-looking innovation driver, right? It's like it's the money you might find and you hope to find and you think you'll find. but it's not something that's particularly bankable in all cases, and that's a real problem. So the budget talks about A, getting you pre-approval, and B, getting that approval down in 90 days instead of 180. Like, you can't wait half a year to know if you've got a SHRED grant in 2025. That's wild. So it's an example of some of the productivity we're doing. But overall, like, there's ITCs, there are reductions in overall rates, and there are big throws in this space because government is going to have to help direct investment, and those other buckets we've talked about are really more directive towards things that we think are necessary and maybe are not. Maybe the market would get there, but it would probably take too long, right? Yeah. In terms of opening up other markets and whatnot. But the foundation of all of this is overall prosperity that's going to come from that productivity.
Yeah, well, one thing that I often hear from founders, and it's a conversation we've actually had up here several times, is like the problem with not the entire problem of the Canadian tech ecosystem, but one of the problems with the Canadian tech ecosystem is from enterprise level. It's what they call the slow no, where like Canadian companies are really good at being like, sure, yeah, maybe. Let's spend 6 months, talk to the whole board, and then like eventually you'll get a no from the board. But then a founder will go down to the States, and within 2 weeks or within a week, one meeting, they'll get sort of a signed letter of intent for $100,000, and they'll do a pilot, and maybe it goes poorly, and they have to readjust. But at least they were able to learn. My hope is that the super productivity deduction, the productivity super deduction, that it helps corporates become a little bit less risk averse and take some of those bets, right?
One of the interesting things when you look at Canada versus the United States is we have very sophisticated capital. You look at the Maple 8, like all of our big funds, right? They tend to like, or even Brookfield, right? Like they pick their moment when they're like, risk is low, return is high, let's go, right? And they go in, and they've been very successful, but risk is low is a big part of their equation. And the Americans, I think they have historically been a little bit, I don't know if I'd say more sophisticated about the benefit risk calculation that we all do on our spreadsheets, but they've certainly been more willing to say, you win some, you lose some, let's go for it, and like the upside is potentially really big when we go into these. And so the slow no is also something you hear a lot in government, and it's maybe a slow yes, slow no. The old adage is like, the best answer is yes. The second best answer is no. The worst answer is maybe. Like, let's not stretch this out, and we've got to move faster on these things. Totally agree.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the big funds like Brookfield, some of the others, Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, one of the largest pension funds in the world, historically. From an investment-wise, like nearly anti-Canadian, not actually, but like very few investments into Canadian tech companies or Canadian. $1 billion of this budget is going to BDC as a fund of funds. One, to spur innovation from emerging managers, which I think is really exciting. Historically, BDC has not invested in emerging managers, but also from some of these pension funds. What about access to capital is going to change if everything's sort of allocated effectively and to some of these like Ontario Teachers Pension Plans?
Yeah, look, I think the obvious logic of a fund of funds is it makes it more desirable for funds to get into that space. And in doing so, it makes capital more readily available and at a different risk profile than those funds have previously been willing to entertain. And it is interesting when you look at all of our large pensions, they in pursuit of stability and return will often go elsewhere, right? Like Canada, let's not overstate it. Like I often hear like, oh, they don't invest in Canada. They do. They invest a lot in Canada.
Anti-Canadian was
it's a big world, and if you've got, say, 15% of your fund in Canada and we are, 0.5% of the world's population, they're still pretty heavily weighted to Canada, but they also should be the first on dial for those Canadian deals because this is their world. They understand it. They're walking through, downtown Toronto. They should have access to these deals in a way that their international competitors don't. But right now they're not interested in those deals. So, some of this is, my hope is at least it will catalyze risk at that $1 billion scale. But then we'll get to multi-billion as they start to see those returns and they start to see the benefit, and they can look at it a little bit differently. But, fundamentally, access to capital is a real struggle for tech in this country. In a way, it's just not in the United States.
Yeah, awesome. Let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. 110 billion over the next 5 years to infrastructure. Some of that earmarked for AI, and you are also the parliamentary secretary for energy. I'm curious, maybe just broadly, like what is Alberta's role in this oncoming wave of AI and data centers, and how can we sort of capitalize on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know Alberta, because of the nature of our electricity market, as much as anything, with the ability to move a little bit faster on some of that, really well positioned. And we have a nice, we have some headwinds and we have some, tailwinds. There's some things really working in our favor. I think that, let's start with the good, right? I think at a municipal level, at a provincial level, at a federal level, we all see the opportunity, and we want to catalyze investment in, some of these data centers that could really unlock and back, a Canadian tech sector. Obviously, it's pretty global, and we can all spin up like an AWS thing tomorrow. It's all good, right? But some of it we do want to have local, and we do want to have access to it for a lot of reasons here, and there's a lot of opportunity that comes directly from it. So that's all good. Like I think that we're creating the incentive packages that will bring these organizations in. We need to find the electricity for it, though, right? Like, it's going to be an incredible draw on the system, which is already expected to be pretty severely strained. And we need the system to be reliable. We need the system to be cheaper, and we need it to be clean. And to do all three of those things at the same time is really, really tough, right? But Alberta does have a few things going for it. Obviously, access to natural gas is, in terms of fossil fuels, it's a very clean one. It's very stable. A Bitcoin miner can use windmills because they stop working. You just stop mining for a bit, right? But if you're talking about like a hyperscaler supporting AI, it's got to have like huge uptime. And so that's going to require a system that is rock solid and very durable. And that's going to be a challenge. Like, we're going to have to work through how we meet our climate ambitions and still provide all of this electricity that's going to be required for it. But the good news is, I think the federal government, the provincial government in particular, they're really working together right now. Lots of conversations happening about what that looks like. Lots of conversations about the clean electricity regulations, which are not going away. I'll just be very clear right now. But lots of appetite to be kind of flexible and thoughtful about how we apply them as we move towards net zero. And also, they only apply when you're on grid. And, everybody wants to be on grid because that provides some of that backup. So you can't just put it all behind the curtain. But it's a nuanced picture that we're all talking about. And I think there's a path to that electricity.
Yeah. Is there sort of you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned hyperscalers. You also mentioned building some of this infrastructure for ourselves as well. And within the budget, it talks about sovereign AI capabilities. How do you balance these two? Of like, we want to attract Google, Microsoft to come here and use our compute, but also we want to have sovereign AI. So how do you balance these two?
Yeah, look, I think that they're complementary, because I think as a nation, and certainly this last year has kind of shown this to us, we need to have some core capacity ourselves, especially for very secure applications. Like defense is next on your list, right? Like we don't want to be keeping our military data in San Jose. Let's just say. But there's a lot of other stuff. We want to make sure that Canadian personal information is within Canada. We need to have that baseline ability to do what governments need to do without relying on other countries. And we know that increasingly that's going to be AI. We know increasingly machine learning is going to take a big part in that. But once we're done that, I think we need to let the market do its thing. It will innovate faster. It will bring in capital. It's just going to move a lot faster. But I don't think we should be thinking about data or sovereign AI or sovereign compute as something that's in competition with that, because that's not the intent. The intent is to provide the backstop and the security that's required for government and defense applications, not to compete with Microsoft on the next data center.
Right. Yeah. And some of these budgets are like I met the other day, sort of by chance. I met this guy. He's the energy procurement. His role is energy procurement for Google. And his budget alone is like $83 billion.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. There's only like 5 Canadian companies that have a bigger market cap than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like bigger than the budget of Alberta. Yeah, it's just, wow.
but so I think like in terms of the opportunity, really exciting and exciting to hear as well that it sounds like the feds and provincially all having this conversation about that being how Alberta is sort of well positioned for kind of this wave, right?
Yeah, well, look, it's a lot easier to work in the Alberta market in many ways if your interest is in building electricity. Like we have like a price mechanism here that doesn't, you've got to work with, no knock on like Ontario Hydro and all of them, but like it's a little more complicated. And as a guy who, by the way, had to sign up for residential electricity in Ottawa, can I tell you, like, the struggle is real. Like when you have these crowns that have monopolies, they are not particularly responsive. And I'll just tell you, I'll get it off my chest. I'll unburden myself. I have an apartment. It's in Hydro Ottawa's jurisdiction, and it will not accept my address to save my life. It keeps telling me it's outside of zone. I've called them. I've been on hold for 3 hours, unable to get a hold of them. I'm just trying to get my bill set up. My landlord is losing patience. That was supposed to be set April or September 1st. It's like $30 a month. It's not a big deal in many ways, but when you don't have the market, you don't have the cues to responsiveness. And so Alberta is a leg up on that front.
Let's talk about defense.
Yeah.
Super interesting. I feel like a year ago, no one in Canada wanted to talk about defense. Maybe like someone.
Yeah.
You could find someone who wanted to, but very unbroadly. Yeah, this wasn't like a on vogue conversation to have.
You weren't like hanging out in coffee shops talking about tank procurement. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, who's going to make our drones? But now all of a sudden we're talking about this. I have the stats here again. $30 billion over the next 5 years for defense, $1 billion to BDC for defense procurement. But like we are a little bit behind in terms of defense tech, right? There's maybe like one or two companies that I've heard of over the last little bit who are building here in Canada some of this stuff. But if you look at worldwide, there's companies like Anduril or other sort of dual use. So how do we get us from again Peter Thiel's terms from 0 to 1 on defense? And like what maybe is that feedback loop for founders to like understand what the government needs and what they want to see from a defense tech company here in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, and I'll try to run through them real fast, and we can dig into any that anybody wants to talk about. But like, first of all, defense procurement has been notoriously slow. That's why there's now a new agency for doing that. And part of that is also making sure that it's not just the established players who have access to some of those contract opportunities. We also know that even things like getting security clearance need to be faster in order to invite more people into the process. Not easier, but faster, right? Like you've got to consider all of those defense applications along the way here. The scale you're talking about, that 30 billion, if anything, understates the long-term trajectory, because we've also said that we're going to get to 5% of GDP spending for, for our NATO obligations, and that is a lot of money. And you mentioned dual use, and I think that's going to be a big part of it. We want to make sure the overall capacity is higher. And for example, building things like ports in the Arctic can increase our defense capacity, but also are of great use to Arctic communities. So there's a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of innovations that are going to happen in there. And when you talk about defense tech, you're right. Like this is not an area you instinctively think of Canada as being a leader in, and we're not. Let's just be plain. We're not, but we can be. We have actually quite a few established defense players. The primes are pretty well rooted, and even a lot of the multinationals, many of which are headquartered in the United States, but act more as like, citizens of the world, shall we say, right? They're employing thousands of people in Canada, and they understand the industry very, very well. We need to pair them with suppliers and innovators and tech companies, and one of the things that we are trying to do as a government is push those primes to use subs that are from all across Canada, from all kind of walks of life, and make better use of that Canadian technology and talent, and also foster and grow that Canadian technology and talent. So as we start procuring in a big way, you are going to see buy Canadian requirements like you have not seen in a long, long time. And that includes with the subs and subcontractors, I mean, not boats, right? And we want to make sure that money is flowing into and supporting and fostering an ecosystem.
So what would that look like, I guess? Is Lockheed a good example? Lockheed Martin on like a global...
Yeah, Lockheed's great. Boeing's great.
Boeing's great, okay. Yeah. And so would that just look like more manufacturing here in Canada where people are working in the space, learning about, and maybe they're not necessarily building defense things, but they're building planes. And then when duty calls, they're able to sort of switch the manufacturing line and create things helpful for defense.
Yeah, so that's part of it for sure. There will be some of that, but of course we're also going to be purchasing like hard military technology, and we know that the nature of the military has changed. You just look at Ukraine, you look at how much drones. There's a no man's land between Ukrainian troops and Russian troops where just killer robots roam, right? And if you walk into it, you're probably going to get shot or very interestingly, like they will even like take you as a prisoner of war. Like the drones will circle you, you put your hands up, and they'll walk you to the line. Because that's actually something they want more than to shoot them for prisoner exchanges. It's very, very wild. It's very sci-fi, but warfare is changing quite rapidly, and we know that those are capacities that we want to have on hand here in Canada. So if you are a Boeing, and if Canada is entering into a contract with you for drones, we're gonna push you on, well, what is your Canadian technology quotient, right? Like, how are you using Canadian suppliers? Have you sourced it? It doesn't exist in Canada. Maybe if you want this contract, you're going to need to help us build it in Canada. And that's going to be a big part of it going forward.
That's, I think the way warfare is changing, at least from my vantage point, is I think there are ways it's changing globally. There are also ways that it's going to be interesting how it affects Canada. But globally, it's like quantity over quality, right? Like the quantity of drones and I think like this might be wrong, so maybe don't quote me on this, but there's Uber's technology where they were using drones to deliver food that has since like changed into a company called Swarm, which I think helps in warfare. So this like high quantity of drones that do like smaller and smaller things that are more difficult to shoot down is kind of the future of warfare. And then paired that with, in Canada, obviously the Arctic opening up as almost a new sort of opportunity, but also, Arctic sovereignty. Yeah. How does Canadian procurement sort of shape both the what the future of warfare requires, but also what like Canada's positioning in the world requires as well?
Well, it's a super interesting question because obviously some of it is follow the leader, like look and see what's happening in theaters across the world where unfortunately a lot of violence is occurring, and saying, well, what is best able to help defend us and our allies and our values going forward? But some of it is going to be uniquely Canadian, which I think is one of the really interesting opportunities. Because look, we've got an enormous Arctic, right? It's like this country is as tall as it is wide, which we forget all of the time. And some of the solutions that worked in Ukraine will not work here for a lot of reasons. They won't have the range, they won't have the tolerance to the cold, and we're going to need to create Canadian solutions as well, especially as the Arctic opens up and we've got to protect our coastlines against the various threats that are out there, whether it be non-state actors or state actors. And one of the things that happened that wasn't like a big dramatic moment in the last 6 months, but actually it hasn't even passed yet, but it will shortly, I suspect. We are giving the Coast Guard more of a role in security than they've previously had, because we are seeing geopolitical adversaries start testing those waters in a very literal sense, going into them and seeing if we will react and respond. And so we're going to need to create Canadian solutions for that, because we have Canadian problems up there, right? Remoteness, cold, these are challenges that no one else is going to solve for us. I mean, if we put out a government tender and say, hey, go find it, yes, I'm sure Boeing will jump to the pump, right? Why not? Why wouldn't they? But we would just as soon and much more prefer that a Canadian company find those.
I'm curious, like if I was like a founder, if I was a would-be founder and I wanted to build a defense tech company, and I said, okay, look, obviously the Arctic is something we're going to need to defend. Should I be like spending my time trying to build hardware that's like drones that will fly in the Arctic? And like, am I just going to waste 5 years of my life and the government will never consider me? Or I suppose like, what will that procurement look like? And is there opportunity for really a true like startup founder? Like if we have a Lucky Palmer in the room, who wants to go start like a defense tech company, could they actually go about and do that here in Canada?
Well, so we want to make it easier for that to be the case. Right now, today that's pretty hard to do. The primes have a pretty strong chokehold on it, in part because of the way we procure these things right now. Really, it's like that old adage, like nobody ever got fired for, doing IBM, hiring IBM, right? And so there tends to be a bias, especially in military applications, towards the tried, tested, and true. It's even more startup averse than I think the general population. But we do need to change that, and we need to incentivize that. And so there's going to be major work to do that and push forward. The path right now often is like partnering with a pre-existing player. I can tell you, like, there is just a surge and a corresponding backlog of people trying to get the licenses to be military vendors because everyone is seeing this gold rush coming. Gold rush, right? Lots of government money. So we're going to have to work through that as well, and we're going to have to be smart about it. And as much as we want to foster Canadian technology, there is also like the requirements too. And so, yeah, there's not an easy answer to that, except to say we're pushing hard in that direction, and we are pushing the established players to work with new entrants and make sure that they're using Canadian content wherever possible. So I would encourage anybody who's got ideas in that space, to both work out or reach out directly to the government, but also to work with the various established players, because it is a very complicated space to work in as well, and it will get less complicated, but it will not become simple because of the nature of the work.
Yeah. Last question before we sort of open it up to audience Q&A. But I'm curious. There's a lot of fun stuff in here regarding consumer-driven banking.
Yeah.
No fees, no transfer fees. Ban that. More transparency on foreign exchange fees. Also proposing legislation for Canadian dollar-backed stablecoins.
Yeah.
Very exciting. And real-time rails is back on track for 2026, which might be super fintech nerdy, but
like instant money transfers. Think instant money transfers.
Yeah, which might not seem important, but like if I have RBC and I want to go to like Nesto to get my mortgage, but it still takes me 3 days to make that mortgage payment, that's a pretty useless sort of account to open. But with real-time rails, now it can go instantaneously, and it's going to be like a Canadian infrastructure.
Yeah, like a standard that is used across our entire financial sector. Yeah, look, I think that, again, this speaks to that innovation agenda, that productivity agenda. Canada has been, I would argue, pretty well served by very stable banks, but what makes them stable is not that it's slow to transfer money. What makes them stable is we exercise prudence in other areas. So we need to take the best of our system and marry it with more competitiveness. And right now, I mean, listen, I'm a banker at CIBC. There's no slight against CIBC. This is not a CIBC. They rule my life. I could never leave them because the complexity of it would be just like over the top, right? And so what we want to do is make it easier that you can look around and say, is this what's best serving me? And now, so that's interesting for competition between the big six banks, but it's more interesting in competition, between those banks and new entrants who might really push the envelope and start creating different products, whether it be new apps. We've got this Neo banner right behind, right? And that's obviously a Calgary success story.
There's some Neo people in the room.
Yeah, go here. Yeah. But it will allow people to compete in a way that, frankly, there hasn't been a ton of competition in banking, because Canadian banking, again, lots of great things over the Americans. Obviously, Interac has been cool when you look at what they have to deal with down there. But there's some real opportunities to really move competition and really move innovation in the next bit.
Yeah, that's great. I think you need competition in all these spaces, right? Like banking, healthcare, telecommunications, all these will spur productivity, right?
Yeah, for sure. And this is like, again, to kind of maybe before questions end where I started, like this is an economist's budget, because it's looking at it and saying, how do we build the base that will allow companies the ability to do things companies do best, innovate, spur each other on, really drive change, while also using that capacity of government, both to do that, but also to secure our long-term strategic objectives as a country. Because, I'll use the example of East-West infrastructure, maybe to wrap. Or provoke, or who knows, right? I worked in a different life on the Energy East pipeline project, which obviously didn't proceed. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I would argue one of the biggest was, at the time, there were a lot of projects. Like Northern Gateway had already gone away, but people were talking about KXL, they were talking about Trans Mountain, they were talking about Energy East. And everybody, it was kind of an open secret in the industry. You couldn't build all of them, right?
Yeah.
And the reason, in my opinion, Energy East was the first to go is because it kind of made the least baseline economic sense. It was the furthest, it was through some complex terrain, you know, the Canadian Shield and all of that. And it was ultimately also going to have to deal with, you know, a lot of political blowback. And so, yes, that was for sure a part of it. But you know, this is a north-south continent, and the other ones looked easier, right? You know, it's a little closer to the coast. It's a lot easier to go south. And nobody valued the east-west part. Like, nobody valued the nation-building component. It just was not something anybody cared about. Well, everybody cares about that stuff now. But that's not the market's job to pay for that. That's our job. So if we want to be building east-west infrastructure, if we want to be tying this country together, government has a role in that, and government policy has a role in that. And so by marrying the overall competitive environment with strong signals from a government, using the weight of government, a wealthy G7 nation with lots of fiscal capacity, can't abuse it, but you want to make smart investments, you can do a lot of good. And companies grow through debt. Everyone in this room knows companies grow through debt. Countries can grow through debt too. It just has to be smart debt, and it has to be debt that has a good return. And that's what the Prime Minister means when he says we want to move from spending to investing.
Cool. That's awesome. Maybe a quick round of applause for Corey Hogan. All right. Any questions, guys? Yeah, way at the back. I'll come to you with this.
I might stand up here so my legs don't go asleep and I don't fall as I walk off.
Hello, great talk and great chat. My name is Philippe. I run a company here in Calgary that helps businesses implement AI systems. So why listening to conversations? Like, we talked about a lot of potential that Canada has. We have the resources, we have the talent, we have all these great things. So my question is, what is holding us back?
Yeah, so I mean, everyone's going to have a different view. I think there's some things that we've clearly established as a government, we believe. One of them is we need to make it easier for people to invest in those companies and be more incentivized to do so, more incentivized to take those risks, more incentivized to buy that piece of machinery that's going to make you more productive, because you can write it off right away with your super deduction and all that. So that's an obvious economic lever that we're pulling. My personal belief is it's also somewhat cultural, right? You end up with a lot of sophisticated but prudent capital that is never first in, right? Is never first in right now. Not never, but you know, I'm exaggerating for effect here. And so we also need to be talking as a country more about, you know, our risk tolerance and how sometimes we got to take that big swing. We got to make that throw. And part of incentivizing people to do that is make it more worth their while. And so that again speaks to some of the tax changes and, you know, ITCs and all of that there. So part cultural, part how we've structured things. And hopefully we'll start addressing both through this budget.
Corey, I left you up there for 1 minute, and you already got the politician's walk going on. I love it. It's great. It's a natural habitat.
I've been a politician for like 6 months.
Does it feel good? Is it natural to walk?
It's all good.
Yeah.
It's like I can.
It's great.
Do the politician.
Did you questions over here? Yeah.
Okay, it's from the defense spending, right? As you talked about, was it $30 billion in 5 years?
That's right.
Okay, what happens afterwards, right?
Well, budgets only go that far horizon. It will go up. So we have already signaled that we're intending to go from 2% of GDP to 5% of GDP. So there will be actually much more defense spending over the next bit. Defense spending does include dual-use technologies, and you know, it includes things like Veterans Affairs. And there's a broad bucket that NATO has defined as what's defense. Like, there's a definition that includes a number of things. But yes, there will be more defense spending. And in some ways, obviously, that's a little sad. The world has become a much more dangerous place, and we need to respond to it. But Canada has the capacity to do it. We've certainly shown in times past we can do it. It's, you know, I remember learning when I was a kid that after World War II, Canada had the third largest Navy, right? That's pretty wild, and I appreciate many of them. The other ones were at the bottom of the ocean, but that's still pretty incredible. And I think that we have that kind of like core capacity because of our wealth, because of our resources, and we're going to have to use more of it to defend ourselves, our allies, and our values.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering questions today, Corey.
Yeah.
I have two for you. One, you said you're older than you look. So what's your secret for staying young?
Yeah.
That's just softball.
Well, look, I mean, it's my dad is in his 70s. 15 years ago, we went to Ireland together. We were mistaken for brothers, so I think it's just genetics. I don't think I'm doing anything special. But like, yeah, I sometimes will, yeah, like as recently as a year ago, here, like just next door at Bank and Barron, I walked in and they're like, "Well, let's see some ID." I'm 43. I said, "My bald spot is my ID." I turned around, but that's just how it goes.
That's awesome. Thank you. So the real question, if AI adoption accelerates faster than policy, where do you think founders need to be most careful ethically and legally so we can innovate faster than being blindsided by sudden?
Yeah, that is an awesome question. I love that question because that is kind of like what history has shown us, right? Governments, they're too far behind, they're too far behind, they're too far behind, and there's like this rubber band thing where they flip ahead almost to like an absurd position where they're overreacting to what's going on. And that is equally troubling, right? So I think that in general, you always want to follow the ball and see where public opinion is on these things, but also know that public opinion is an interest. I'm going to put on like a past hat. So I used to be at a communications technology firm. In like 2015, we did a poll on, it was one of my favorite polls. So we were asking people their feelings about tech, and one of them was about targeted ads. So I think most of the people in this room would know what a targeted ad is, right? So we said, how do you feel about retargeting? And retargeting, people were like 80% okay. And we said, how do you feel about an ad where somebody puts a small bit of data on your computer and then feeds you ads based on that data? Went like 80% the other way, right? People do not understand the world that they're in. They don't, they worry about it when the media says you should worry about it. They give away all of their privacy through like these end user license agreements all the time. Like anybody who tells me they've read Apple's license agreement is a liar. I just do not believe you. So
3 days I will never get.
yeah, okay, well there you go. Yeah, but all to say this, right? Like, be careful about polling on it. I'm actually not suggesting anyone poll on these things because they're kind of hard. But like, keep attuned to the vibes, right? And make sure that if you think you're in a space that might be tricky down the road, that you are making sure that policymakers, most of which have not worked at tech startups like I have, are at least aware of like, okay, somebody might come to you with this challenge. Here's why it's not a challenge. Here's the global context. Here's what it really means. And here's the analog equivalent. Because the other thing I find a lot in the technology space, and I'm sure you all do too, is it is compared to like a perfect, idealized privacy that doesn't even exist in the analog, right? Like, so like the alternative in the real world has often got many more holes and many more challenges in terms of like safeguards. But people just say, well, how come this is possible in this very rare edge case that this could happen? So you got to keep them rooted in the alternatives as well.
Good job, Becky.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Corey, for that breakdown of the budget. I'd be remiss to not mention the headline that came out today that the Canadian government spent $19.5 billion on external consultants this year. Do you see a path forward where use of responsible AI can reduce that dependency?
I absolutely do. I mean, I always think, having been a consultant in the past too, like, look, can I start with my philosophical view of consultants? We want to reduce wasteful spending. Everybody wants to reduce wasteful spending, but like, there are core competencies to government, and then there are incompetencies of government. And government doesn't need to be great at everything as long as those other things are at hand, right? Yes, you don't want to outsource core competencies. You want government to be able to work all of the time. It's designed to be durable, right? In many ways, government's insurance, it's got to have, it's got to have 5 nines of uptime, right? But so there's a place for consultants. There is absolutely a place for consultants. And I think in many previous decades, we would talk about the benefits of privatization, right? We would talk about how we wanted to make sure that there wasn't kind of a sclerotic bureaucracy managing it when a company could come in and do it better. So like those like kind of shock numbers always kind of irk me. Like that, I don't think that's the conversation to have. The conversation we always need to be having is, are we spending government money well? Is the public service the best vehicle through which to do this? Is the private sector the best vehicle to do this? And we've got to kind of stay on top of those things always. Like that's not even a left or right thing. That's just a good manager thing. That's true in every one of your companies.
Yeah.
As a policymaker, where do you see AI penetrating most in Canada in the next 3 years? Let's say what's real? From your point of view, what's looking real where AI will be there?
Well, lots of opinions about that. My background has largely been the intersection of comms and technology. And so I definitely see how exposed comms is to LLMs, right? It's something that we thought a lot about at the university. Like we were building custom tools, wrapping on the OpenAI APIs, and we were seeing some pretty significant gains on what I would call low-value comms work that infiltrates any large organization. Like we've got to send an email that the server's down on the weekend. Is someone going to spend an hour writing that, or are they just going to put the pertinent details in and go, right? So I do think there's places that are particularly exposed to words, maybe especially so because of all of the buzz around large language models. But I actually think that the opportunities are, broader, and I'm more excited maybe about some of the other machine learning that's out there. Like and it's not even that new at this point, but I was meeting with some people at a company who they have fiber optics along a pipeline, and they can tell if there's any disturbance within, a great distance of that pipeline, just based on vibrations in the ground, changes in temperature, changes in sound, and those allow pipelines to operate safer, right? Like when we talk about oncology, there are opportunities to identify tumors that doctors would miss. And I actually think that the biggest or most undervalued opportunity that I'll maybe say is the non-LLM space. Like we are in such a crazy hype for LLM, and I love LLMs. I actually think that we've gone way too far down the hype curve on LLMs, and everyone's saying they're terrible, they're great, they're amazing. But I think they are sucking so much of the oxygen of the conversation, and it's some of the more fundamental machine learning that it's gonna fundamentally change people's lives.
Let's go to one more question. Yeah.
You didn't speak to the housing budget at all, and I wonder if you would be
Yeah.
willing to speak to that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that are going on. First of all, one of the interesting things when we were talking about, Alberta and data centers is I was also thinking about Alberta and tech, and one of the things that we have is affordability, right? Like this is the preamble. I will answer your question, I promise. We need to make sure that we can establish communities in affordable areas. That's going to be a big part of our secret sauce here. And Calgary passed a grim milestone a couple of years ago where an average income is no longer enough to purchase the average house price. Ontario's way ahead of us. The Toronto, Ottawa markets, they're way more expensive. Like you wouldn't be able to buy an average house with the average income for a decade in those communities, right? And it's gotten out of hand. It's been getting out of hand for a long time. It's been, if you pull up the charts, you'll see basically around 2001, incomes and house prices just split, and they've been basically on the same trajectory split ever since through governments of multiple stripes, and shame on all of us for not being on top of it, but now we need to fix it. And the budget has $7 billion additional dollars on top of $25 billion for building housing and incentivizing housing. And there's a couple of things that are happening. And it's going to take a land, sea, and air approach. You're going to have incentives that allow the private market to do what they need to do. And we need that. I always tell people the crazy thing about housing, as somebody who works for the government, it's like the only sector that's bigger than government. Like government can't push housing around the way it can at basically any other sector with its purchasing power, right? So you need to help the private sector build housing, and the decision making happens at the margins. You've got lots of powers to change tax laws, regulations. You can build more stuff. But the market is going to move towards market housing because that's what markets do. I mean, it's definitional, right? So the government's going to need to be very involved in the affordable housing aspect, which has largely disappeared. Like there haven't been investments really since the 90s in affordable housing from the government. And yes, the overall fixing of the market and increasing more market housing will ultimately trickle down. No one wants to wait for the trickle down. People want housing today. People need things fixed today. So there is major spending that's going to be going on with Build Canada Homes, and it's tied to a bunch of other initiatives, including buying Canadian. We want to make sure that we are using Canadian lumber. We want to modernize our housing sector. So it's a part of tech, but it's not one that often comes to mind, right? Canada builds very few houses in a modular fashion. When you compare us to Europeans, like Scandinavians, the Japanese, most of the rest of the world doesn't really build houses out of wood, but even those who are not building out of wood, like it's much more modular everywhere else. And so we need to modernize the technology of our housing structure as well. So these things all kind of stack together, but it's going to take money and it's going to take partnerships. Oh wait, sorry, you're the
Yeah. Your point about building with wood.
Yeah.
That's kind of a North American habit. Will there
Yeah.
be any motivation anywhere in any of these sectors to move away from using wood to build houses?
Well, I actually quite like wood. Now there's downsides, right? It doesn't last as long, right? You can have a concrete house in Germany that lasts for literal generations. A brick house in the United Kingdom, same deal. But there are some advantages. Some of them are environmental. And I actually think, if anything, we're probably, as Canadians, better served by looking at wood's applications on kind of the mid-rise and high-rise side, too. And so the Austrians, in particular, are very sophisticated in their approach to building engineered wood products. It's kind of crazy, but so BC, about half of the engineered wood builds in North America occur in BC. BC is really kind of on this, but they're actually getting that product largely from Europe. Like, we have all of these forests. We have a forestry sector that could do this, but we need to incent investments, in capital purchases that would allow our industries to retool and meet some of this new demand that's going on. And Canadian wood is actually an incredible foundation for it. I'll always be an evangelist for Canadian forestry sector. It's what my family worked in for centuries. It's also what I happen to be parliamentary secretary responsible for, is forestry. And I'll tell you this. The Europeans they have plantations. The South Americans have plantations. The Americans have plantations where they just have monocultures of trees, one after the other, like this. We don't do that. We make forest companies go back to what was there before, mix of wood products, and we grow it much longer. And because of our cold, and because that wood is growing in competition and the diversity, and we grow it longer, it actually is a much, much higher quality wood product. It has a much higher strength ratio. And so we are actually better positioned than anyone else to build these engineered wood products, and we don't do it. So I think there's huge opportunity for us to look at modern building, but modern building doesn't probably mean concrete. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Corey, thank you so much. That was so much fun.
Okay, yeah.
One more time for
Cheers.
Corey. Let's go.